I want to take a second here and pause and acknowledge some comments that were made by you and me and others that may have been present on this show in some past episodes. We had a individual that reached out to us and didn't appreciate some of the verbiage that we had used. And I want everybody that's listening to know that even though we may have come across as dismissive, sometimes outdated, or lacking in empathy towards survivors of sexual violence, we recognize that harm that words can cause, especially when they minimize the trauma and place blame on those who have already experienced unimaginable pain. We want to be clear that the purpose of this podcast, especially in this season, that we're looking to explore the case of the Center City Rapist. And it's to center on both victims and survivors. Their experiences, their voices, and their right to justice are why we do this work, both Jim and I.
Sean told him he was Shannon's brother and he'd been trying to reach her and she didn't show up at lunch. And Parm went pale white. When we talk about what actually happened to Shannon, Parm had called 911 before, and he had heard Shannon scream for help. He called police.
Welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you tonight?
I'm doing okay, Ray. I'm anxious to hear episode 3 of this Center City Rapist case. Walk us through it.
Well, this season, we here at Cold Red Podcast are dedicating our entire season to a case that both Fitz and I had the opportunity to work with Philadelphia Homicide back in the 90s called the Center City Rapist. And we're going to have some very interesting guests that we've had on previously who were directly involved in the case and its aftermath. First, we'd like to welcome back to the show from last week, retired Philadelphia Police Detective Chuck Boyle. Chuck, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Also joining us today is Syl Schieber, Shannon Schieber's father. Syl, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ray. It's a story that has long needed to be told. It's not the easiest story for a father to tell about his daughter, but it's a story that is important for a lot of people.
I want to do a quick recap, just so we can kind of catch everybody up in case you're just tuning into us for this episode. We talked about in our first 2 episodes, we talked about 4 assaults, sexual assaults on 4 separate females. And during that time when those assaults were going on, there were no suspects. However, by the time of the 3rd and 4th assault, investigators began believing that there may be a connection. And then on May 5th, while Shannon is walking home, she reports someone that is following her when she's coming home from the movies. Sly, you left off saying that you were going to explain what happened to Shannon and why you were forced to take action against Philadelphia. I would really love to know, and so would our audience, about Shannon. What type of woman was Shannon? I'd like to know as much as you can, or you're willing to tell us about her.
Shannon was the apple of our eye. She was born on the 8th day of August in 1974, early in the morning. For those of you who are old enough to remember, as I was driving home that morning, the news headlines were that President Richard Nixon was going to announce his resignation that day. It also happened that the next day when he actually resigned, I was being awarded my PhD by the University of Notre Dame. Pretty monumental couple days at our house. Shannon, in her first months, was a terror. She hated that she wouldn't sleep. She cried incessantly. We took her to the doctor. There was no colic. There was finally at some juncture he says, your problem is you got a bright kid here, and her brain's moving a lot faster than her body is willing to go. By the time she was 18 months old, she knew her ABCs. When she was 2, she was in the back in those days, people put their kids in car seats in the front seat. She was with Vicky driving down the road, and there was a pickup in front of them. And back then, one of the Japanese brands was Datsun, and Shannon was looking. She's, Mommy, DATSUN spells truck. Mommy spells truck. She had put together the linkage between letters and words at that juncture. By 3, she was reading. She was a bright kid. We had trouble in grade school. She was always ahead of the class in terms of the work they were doing, especially in mathematics. We finally had to take her out of the school that she was in because they wouldn't ability group the kid. She went on to high school in the Washington, D.C. suburbs in Maryland. When she was a senior in high school, she was president of the student body at Bethesda Chevy High School, which then had a student body of around, 1,300 students, somewhat larger now. She was accepted at Dartmouth, at Brown, at Notre Dame, at Duke. Harvard called. They had her wait listed and said if she'd accept, they'd give her a slot. She ended up going to Duke University. She was not only an academic, she loved to ride horses. And so she went to Duke University. She graduated in 3 years, had a triple major, mathematics, economics, and philosophy. Her last year there, she was co-captain of the equestrian team. She not only was smart and quite athletically capable, she also had a really big heart. She was one of the kindest, most concerned people that you would ever know. Yeah, the night she was killed at 2:00 in the morning. That afternoon, some students over at West Philadelphia Catholic High School were having a reception for her. She had gone over there in the fall of 97 when she got to the Wharton School and offered to teach what we'd call a financial literacy class now to these inner city minority students. She wasn't paid. Nobody told her she needed to do it for any reason. She went over there because she worried about these kinds of things. She taught them about stocks and bonds and bank accounts and how to do budgets. Helped them set up a mock business in the second semester and run the business, do a business plan, keep the books, and so the students to thank her were going to hold a reception for her and were extremely disappointed when she didn't show up because of course at that juncture she was no longer with us here on the earth. She was an extremely loving child. She and I had quite a kind of a unique relationship. She was studying economics and finance. My PhD was in economics. We intended to write a paper for publication together the summer of 98. She was 2 days from the end of the school year. She and I had a fairly extensive written exchange in a couple days before she died about what she was thinking about in terms of her own career and so forth, and then what we were going to do this during the summer. She also, as a hobby, I'm a woodworker, and she had me furnishing a house before she could get a house. So we were going to build a dresser for her during the summer. Ironically, something that most people can't begin to fathom, she was actually killed in a bed which I had built for her. She was just a special kid all around, and everybody that knew her thought so. She had professors and memorials, both from Duke and at Wharton, say, that once every few years a special student came along, and that at the end of their careers there'd be 10 or 15 of them that they would remember, and they would put her in that group. So anyway, that was who Shannon Schieber was. And when she died in Philadelphia, it was not just a Schieber tragedy. It was a Philadelphia tragedy. I think generally it was a tragedy for humankind because she had intentions to. We always told both of our children that they needed to make the world a better place, and she bought that line, hook, line, and sinker. So it was a tragedy.
We get into that tragedy. Chuck, when did you come onto the scene with this? Were you one of the initial individuals that was called out after the initial call, the 911 call regarding this? No?
No. It was, so how it works in homicide is there were 3 squads, and then we had what you call the desk guy, the desk man. He answered the phone. He was what we call the up guy, and we worked on a wheel. So if you were in a squad at this point, I was in SIU with Jeffrey and another detective, and we were doing like unsolved cases. They call them today cold cases or whatever. So when that call came in that night, the homicide only goes out, or wasn't that night, it was that afternoon. So it was day work. When homicide, they don't go out until they're notified by police radio. And then police radio to notification sheet. The call's made from radio to the homicide. The desk man picks up the up man picks up the phone, starts to pencil in the run sheet and put in pertinent information. Medical examiner notified. Crime scene unit notified. If person's taken to a hospital or whatever, cause of death here, Shannon's body was still at the scene and everything else. So the line squad went out. It was a Sergeant Musey, a Detective Tomeno. There was Detective Walsh and Detective Engeloff went out to that scene at that time. And I mean, I can tell you exactly what they found. So,
well, before you go there, so I just wanted to get an idea of what homicide does in those things. But how did you first become aware of what happened?
Well, I was in the homicide when I came into work later that day. We heard about this murder, and it was all over the news. The news, 6 o'clock, whatever. It was all over the 11 o'clock and whatever. And at the time, it was still in the line squad. And it went for like a couple weeks till finally it was transferred to SIU and a task force was put together. And then the job was transferred from Detective Tomeno to my partner. They split us up, and Jeffrey became the assigned detective on the Shannon Schieber case.
And
So,
Syl, I was going to say, Syl, you told us a very beautiful part of Shannon's life. Now you're about to share with us, no doubt, the worst day of your life, and it didn't get too much better from there. How did you find out? How did you know something was amiss on this evening, on this next day?
Shannon, our son Sean, was going to be passing through town that day, and he and Shannon were supposed to have lunch. He actually was supposed to go up the night before, but she called him and told him, look, I'm studying for final exams. If you come up, I'm just not going to, we're not going to be able to do anything anyway, so why don't you wait and come up tomorrow? We'll have lunch together. So Sean got to Wharton around 12:30 or so that day, and that's where they had agreed to meet. And he ran into one of her friends that he had met before, a fellow named Martin Halleck. And Martin told him that Shannon was supposed to be there at 9 that morning for a study group. A group of students together were going to study for a big exam, finance exam they had done on Friday. This was early Thursday morning that she was attacked. Well, Shannon hadn't shown up, and Martin said he tried to call her and didn't get through. Sean tried to call her and didn't got her answering machine. This was before the day of cell phones, so everything was landline stuff. So finally, around 1:15, 1:30, Sean decided he needed to go over to her apartment and see what was going on. Martin told him where they had been studying. Again, this group had been studying together the night before, and they had gone home, 9 o'clock or so, and he had ridden back to Center City with her in her car, and Martin told Sean where she'd parked. Sean went over to her apartment, and he saw that she lived it was an old brownstone house that had been converted into 6 apartments. And she was on the second floor. And the front of the apartment, 3rd Street, ran down in front. And then on the south side of the house was Manning Street. Manning Street, a lot of these old early American towns or cities have streets that were really carriage paths originally. So Manning Street was more an alley than a street. But the entryway into the center and the upper stories of this apartment was on the Manning Street side. So she lived on the second floor, and as you were facing the door, she was to the right. She was in the back of the house. And she had a little patio landing and a sliding glass door to that patio. And Sean got to the apartment, and he looked up, and the patio door was open, and the curtain in that window was closed, and he immediately was concerned that if that door was open, it meant that she was there, because she wouldn't have left the apartment with the door open. And when he rang the doorbell, he didn't get an answer, and he immediately recognized that there was something amiss. Well, he needed to to confer with one of us. So he wanted to talk to his mom. I had a lunch that day, a business lunch, and so he and a friend were supposed to, after he and Shannon had lunch, were going to caravan up to Massachusetts. They were going to college graduation up there. They had graduated a year before, and they were going back for graduation for some of their friends. So he went over to Samantha Calamari was her name. They called her Sam. Went over to Sam's apartment, and he called Vicky, and he told Vicky what had been happening. Well, Vicky said, "You got to get back there, and you got to ring those doorbells. You got to get in there. You got to call the landlord. You got to get into that apartment." So Sam went back with him, and when they got back there, they started ringing doorbells. Sam also looked up and saw that the patio door was open, and finally somebody buzzed him in, and he came downstairs. It was Parm Greeley. Parm, Sean told him he was Shannon's brother, and he'd been trying to reach her, and she didn't show up at lunch. And Parm went pale white when we talk about what actually happened to Shannon. Parm had called 911 before, and he had heard Shannon scream for help. He called police. Parm went pale when Sean told him who he was, and they turned around and they ran upstairs.
Before you go there, can you tell us what happened with that 911 call that you're aware of with Parm?
Yeah. So it was around 2:00 in the morning. Shannon was in the back second floor apartment. There was an apartment underneath her, and there was a woman lived there, a student named Amy Reed. Parm Greeley lived across the hall from her with his fiancée, Leah Basikas. So around 1:00 that morning, a little before 1, Amy Reed was getting ready to go to bed. And she heard a commotion in the apartment immediately above her. If you think about it being an old house, wooden floors, you certainly can hear when things are going on a floor above you. So she heard some kind of pretty significant commotion shift. Parm heard Shannon calling out for somebody to get away from her. He heard some things falling also. He assumed it was some kind of a domestic argument. And he didn't, he was a little concerned about what was going on. So Amy went to bed, and Parm's fiancée, Leah, went to bed. They were both asleep. Around 2:00 that morning, Parm heard Shannon scream for help. Shannon had a rather distinctive voice. She complained about it sometimes. I think she inherited it from her dad. She had kind of a low-pitched voice for a woman. I've got a bit of a low-pitched voice, I guess. And so it was a pretty recognizable voice. He went over and he knocked on her door and he said, Shannon, are you okay? And he heard a choking sound. So he immediately went over and dialed 911. The time of the call, according to the 9/11 logs, 2:04:22. Greeley says, hello, my next door neighbor. I just heard her yelling for help. Dispatcher asked for the address, gave him the address, 251 South 23rd Street. They were asking for information to the house or apartment, what floor is it on? And he was answering it. And he finally says, we're on the second floor. I'm on one side, she's on the other. I just heard her yell help. I knocked on the door and I just heard like a choking sound, and I called. So that phone call took about 50 seconds. It was a very quick call. The dispatcher put out a call to the radio patrol calls. It went out at 2:05:10 a.m. So it was less than a minute after Parm made his call. Within 6 minutes or so, 2 patrol officers pulled up at the house. As soon as Parm got finished with his 911 call, he ran downstairs and he pounded on Amy Reed's door. Amy Reed was the woman right below her. Amy Reed's fiance was a med student. His name's Human Nordkausen. And Parm would later say that he wanted to go down and he wanted to get Human to come and back him up because he was thinking about taking the door. He was that concerned about what he heard. Well, Human was not there. He was over at the lab. And so he pounded on Amy's door, woke her up. She would say later it was not a kind of a gentle knock. She said he was pounding and he was pretty excited and he was out of breath. So she got up and quickly put on some clothes and she came out and he told her again what had happened, that he'd heard Shannon scream for help. He'd heard the choking sound. So she stood there right outside her door. So her door was a little bit, probably 10 feet from the central entry door. So she was on the first floor. So the entryway for the stairway for the apartments further up was in the kind of the center of the house. She stood there kind of between her door and the entryway that goes up to the second and third floor, waiting for the police to come. So she's standing right under Shannon's balcony. And then when the police arrive, at first they go to the front apartment on the first floor, which had its own separate entrance also. And she went over and she told the officers, come on around here. And Parham came down and he immediately met the officers there. And he told them what he had heard. Amy said that she told them that she had heard a scuffle, and they went up. They followed Parham up to the landing between Parham's apartment and Shannon's apartment, and they started pounding on the door. And as you know, nobody answered. So they started asking Parham questions. Couldn't this noise have come from outside somewhere? It's 2 a.m. The bars are closing. Couldn't it come from down the street? Couldn't it come from across the street, another apartment or something? And Parham was, Amy later would say, Parham was just saying, no, that's not right. She said, when he came down and knocked on my door, he knew what he heard. He knew who he heard. He knew where those screams had come from. And he conveyed that to the police. But the police were skeptical. And finally, one of them, according to Amy, turned to Parham and said, won't you be embarrassed if we break this door down and there's nothing going on? And Parham responded something to the effect, yeah, I'd be embarrassed, but I'd be relieved, or something along those lines. And they said, well, we're not going to break the door down. And from thereafter, the line these officers had was that one of them called Parham a very wishy-washy guy. Another focused on, he said he'd be embarrassed if we broke the door down. Said that he told them that they shouldn't take the door down on his account. When he was interviewed by the homicide detectives, the way the interviews were done is it wasn't a recorded, audio recorded or video recorded interview. The interrogator, the questioning officer, interrogating officer, would ask a question. He would write out what the question was, and then would write out the answer that the respondent gave. And then at the end of the interview, the respondent was supposed to read through the interview and sign each page and make any corrections along the way. In the interview of Parham, there was a question about what happened. He started off, the officer asked, and that was scratched out. And then it went on, I said I'd be embarrassed if they broke the door down on my account. He put in an addition in what the officer wrote down. He said, I said I would be embarrassed if there was nothing going on and they took the door down on my account. But the critical issue here was, and Amy later testified, that after he was kind of dismissing all of these suggestions they were making, they turned to him and they said, won't you be embarrassed if we break this door down and there's nothing going on? They left the premises.
Can I interrupt you for one thing?
Yep, go ahead.
Tell him what the one officer did with Amy, because this is important.
Well, actually, both officers ended up with Amy Reed there. No, and they went outside and they pointed their lights up at Shannon's windows. The sliding glass door was closed. And the curtain was closed. Now, this sliding glass door and the position of the sliding glass door at these various times would become quite important, because if those two officers were standing there at 2:00 in the morning, shining their light up, and it was closed, and Sean gets there the next afternoon and it's wide open, it suggests awfully strongly that the assailant was in there when the police officers were there. People tied themselves in knots trying to explain how that door got opened. They said that Sean went in there, and when he saw his sister's body, he got sick and went over and opened it. We had officers suggesting that the assailant had already left before the officers got there, but decided later he forgot something and went back and went in and didn't close it when he left the second time. We even had one officer suggest that maybe gravity opened the door. It was a sliding glass door that opened horizontally, so it would have been quite an interesting physics study if anybody was going to take that seriously.
And Syl, all three of those explanations certainly work to exonerate the officers from their decision that night, be it gravity, be it the offender going back in. Very rare, in spite of what Sherlock Holmes used to say, always returning to the scene of the crime, very rare in real life. Yeah, Syl, all these are very convenient for the defendants in a case like this when it eventually goes to a lawsuit. But
now you might remember, as we were talking about the earlier cases, I talked about Patrol Officer 1 and Patrol Officer 2.
Correct.
Patrol Officer 1 had been an officer holding two of the scenes of the prior attack, and Patrol Officer 2 had been on the scene of one of the other prior attacks. They had touched the earlier crimes. Now, that didn't mean that they were necessarily culpable. I've never been a police officer, a patrol officer. I am sure when you're out dealing with chaos day in and day out, you don't put all the dots together of all of these chaotic events that you have. Somebody else should have been doing this, and we're gonna talk at some juncture about why cases 1, 2, 3, and 4, Amy, Belle, Cora, and Diane, should have been put together long before those two officers got there that night. But
Syl, I want to make sure for our listeners and our viewers, the two officers at Shannon's door that night, are you saying they were also at the other earlier rape scenes?
They were at three of the other scenes.
Well, all the chaos you described, I have been a police officer. I know Chuck has too, and patrol officer. And stranger rapes don't happen that often, even in big cities. That can be linked in a geographic area, in a modus operandi area. Yeah, I sometimes am empathetic to to these officers and decisions they have to make in a split second. The more I'm being reminded of this case, and Ray and I were brought into this case by Chuck and his colleagues eventually, but what a critical decision that was made or not made that night, and how that could have affected everything from that point on.
As they were leaving, they told the neighbors that were there that if they heard anything else, they should call 911 back. Amy said that Parm said something to the effect, "Yeah, when I start to smell something."
Oh boy.
You know, the idea that this guy who was running up and down the steps frantically, who was pounding on doors, all of a sudden became a wet noodle the moment the officers arrived is just a hard one for me to believe. The real kicker here, when they called in their unfounded, and you look at the time from the time they got there till the time they left, they were on the scene for 5 minutes and 9 seconds.
I'm a firm believer that if it walks like a duck and it looks like a duck, then it's a duck. And I think that those two officers being on 3 other of these sexual assaults, which, by the way, were not called sexual assaults at the time. They were treated as, what we call it, Chuck? A person of interest?
Investigation of person.
Right.
Investigation of person.
Investigation of person, which is really nothing. So when you're seeing something like this, had there been a connection made by detectives, and not just these 2 patrol officers, but by sex crimes and everybody else, it would have made a huge, huge difference, because that information would have been put out. Chuck, am I right? When that information's there, that's put out at roll call for these guys, and so that they know what's going on?
They would have had a task force. I knew about different things in the job because Jeff and I would talk, but he was on the job, and I'll try to explain. I've always tried to defend the 2 police officers, because when we were brought in, we were told that See, and here's the problem that we had. By the time I came onto the job, we were ordered by our lieutenant not to have any dealings with the Schiebers. And so I never talked to Sean. I never talked to Sean until this March 1st. It was the first time I ever met Sean or talked to him. And my question to him was, are you sure that you never opened that door? Because what we were told was that Sean became sick and ran over and opened the sliding glass door, which would explain when the officers looked at the sliding glass door was closed, that Sean opened it up the next day. But Sean was with the girl he was going to go up to their graduation with, right? But listen, I know it's a tough decision for young officers to make upon themselves. That's why
Sergeants, you have a sergeant.
this is why they have supervisors. A lieutenant was supposed to have responded to that call. And based on all that information there, even though they didn't know that there was a serial rapist that had worked in the summer of 97, June, July, and August, based on the totality of what this was, the supervisor very well could have said, take the door. It's on him. But here's what happens in the police department. These two officers kicked the door in, and I'm not defending, and nothing's there, right? Now they have an open property. The lieutenant's now mad at them because they have to leave an officer there, they're one officer down. Then the day work, if they can't get a hold of the landlord to secure the property, they have to put a day work officer down there. So these two guys become pariahs in their own with their supervisors because they took it upon themselves. That decision was an easy decision to make by a supervisor. I won't go in any more as we go along. There are so many failures in this whole thing with supervision that I'm embarrassed. It's the only thing I can say. I'm embarrassed.
Yeah, but Chuck, think about this. Had you and Jeffrey been aware of what happened in those first 4 assaults, even in the first 2 assaults, if you had any inkling of what was going on, you would approach that in a totally different fashion. You wouldn't have approached it in the way you did. Yeah, you may have done some things, but you would have known that, hey, this is something that's going on here that's working, because after Shannon, he goes dormant.
The thing about it is that it was so simple thing that the summer of 97 to put together. Like we talked before, it's 4 jobs within a football field. I swear to God, when I talk about that, 16, 7, maybe 3 football fields if you went and did the L, right, of these jobs. And they're white females that are young white females. By the way, everybody in that apartment that Shannon lived in were students. So these aren't like, transient people or whatever. They're studying, Parm was going to be a doctor or whatever. There was the guy downstairs. I mean, these are all educated.
Amy and Human and Parm, they all became MDs.
MDs.
Amy and Human both had both MDs and PhDs. But these were not the village idiot.
And all these girls. So what happens is when you see, you guys notice because that's what you deal with. You see a pattern. This pattern is plain as the nose on your face. I mean, I'm just shocked that embarrassed. That's all I can say.
Chuck, we could Monday morning quarterback all we want here.
I know that. I know.
But it's if we can shed some light on something here that may make a difference in other officers or in other cases throughout this country or throughout the world, for that matter, then it's all worth it.
That's
because
why I'm here today. That is why after I reached out and talked to Mr. Schieber and we sat down and we talked, and then he had handed me this letter that was addressed to me, that I decided that we needed to put this out there. This story needs to be told so that it never, ever happens. I'm a father. I had a mother. I have a wife. I have 2 daughters. I have 3 granddaughters. If they were treated like this, like those, like Abby Bell, these 4 girls, why do you wear a badge? Why do you have a badge if you're not going to do your job? And I'm not talking about these 2 officers. They were young officers, but based on what I know now and everything else, that sliding glass door was closed when they left, open when Sean was there. It was in there at that time.
Yeah, I agree.
When Sean called his mother and told his mother what happened, that door was open. She immediately called me. Then she went into the women's bathroom where she worked and sat in a stall crying, praying to God that Shannon was all right. I immediately called Martin Halleck Sean had already called Martin Halleck and told him that the door was open. So Vicky knew the door was open. I knew the door was open. Sam and Sean knew the door was open. Martin Halleck knew the door was open before anybody got into that building. The idea that we somehow conspired and made all this up. Sean and Sam were independently interviewed at homicide within an hour and a half after her body was found. And both of them told the officer in that initial interview that the door was open when they got to the apartment before they got in the building. Martin Halleck testified in a sworn deposition that he had been told that the door was open. Vicky's told, the idea that somehow we cooked up this story to make the police look bad is just crazy.
Syl,
We all went into panic mode the moment we heard that door was open, and Shannon wouldn't answer her telephone or her doorbell. I mean, think about your child being in this kind of environment. Wouldn't you begin to panic? That's what set us off.
and it's your other child who is living through this and being the conduit of this information.
Absolutely.
Speaking of Sean, can you walk us through, as tough as this is, he sees the outside door. He eventually gets to the door of the apartment. It gets open somehow.
They go up to Parm's apartment, and Parm tries to call the landlord. He gets a recording. Parm's 6'5", weighs 250 pounds. He's a big guy. He went over, put his shoulder to that door, and went through the door. And Sean went in right behind him, and he saw his sister laying there on the bed, naked, face all bruised up, and they could see she was dead. He went down on the floor in shock. He said he squeezed his eyes shut, thinking he was having a horrible nightmare, and when he opened them up, it would be just this mad dream. And then finally, Parm backed out, and Sam was there, kind of kneading Sean's shoulders and Parm called 911, and within a few minutes, a fire truck and a patrol car were there, and the officer came up and said, you folks need to move across the hall. This is a crime scene. And so they immediately were transported down to police headquarters, and of course were interrogated. Sam called. Sean said, "I got to call Mom," and Sam said, "You can't do that. I'll call." And Sam told Vicky, "You got to come to. There's something happened here. You got to come to Philadelphia." And Vicky said, "You got to tell me what." And she said, "Shannon's dead." And then Vicky called me hysterically, and we met at home. Vicky worked in downtown D.C. I worked in out in the Maryland suburbs. We met at home. We lived in Chevy Chase, and we drove to Philadelphia in a horrible rain that day. Got caught going up 95 behind a highway patrolman, and I wanted to really step on the gas, but was scared to death I'd waste time trying to convince him. So anyway, it took us 3.5 hours, an extra hour to get to Philadelphia that day because of the horrible weather, and by the time we arrived there, we were met by a detective and a sergeant, Tony Tomato and Paul Musey, and they told us the homicide. We knew immediately what we're dealing with, and
I am so sorry that you and your wife. That's not the way things are supposed to happen. I'm so sorry that happened to you guys.
Well, the next problem was that the city and the police department went into it ain't us mode. Timothy went out the next day and held a press conference. He said that he had done a investigation into how they had responded to the 911 call. That the guy that had called 911 was very uncertain about what he had heard and where it had come from. He said that a senior officer was called to the scene to certify the decision these two officers made. He said it was regrettable in 2020 hindsight, but the police couldn't be going around the city kicking in doors. Now, I never ever could find evidence that there was anything that a real police officer would call an investigation that was done. There was never any evidence presented that a senior officer was either on the scene or had been summoned to the scene. And we had officers fairly quickly telling us and other people who were being interrogated that the two officers screwed up that night. When we cleaned out Shannon's apartment, there were two detectives there. They told us that these were just Clinton cops. They hadn't been properly qualified or properly trained. So we were here. Yeah, some of these criticisms against these two officers, I think, are unfair.
Well, I'm just sitting here listening. When every time I hear that, I feel like whoever told you that, I'd like to punch him right in the mouth. Because
in John Timoney's deposition, he talked about Clinton cops. He said we had all these extra cops, and we put these guys. There were so many of them, we put them out in the patrol cars by themselves, and there weren't senior officers out there to help them. So a lot of people were talking about how the Clinton cops had screwed up the system, including the commissioner.
then that's
Now,
what
I think that the lesson here, and Timoney actually changed the training program. He talked about he kept defending. He defended his officers, but in his deposition he talked about the training, and he said, I changed the training because these young guys. He says, they come in, they've got all this classroom training. And then we get done at the end of the day, we put them out there in these souped up cars. They've got lights that they can turn on and sirens and everything's going crazy around them. And he said, we throw them in the deep end of the pool. And he said, you got to change the program so you would have, 3 months of classroom work, and then you'd have 3 months in a patrol car with a senior officer with you, learning the actual ropes on the street. And so you kind of acclimate yourself. You get your blood pressure down and figure out how to do things. So even Timoney was talking about, he wouldn't dare admit that anything that happened the night Shannon was killed was wrong, but he needed to change things to make him better. I applaud his making him better. I've always been a little discouraged about his.
He was like the information that he was receiving, and I know I was not on any of these meetings and stuff. Other supervisors were, oh, no, there was a supervisor there. Let's make it perfectly clear. There was never a supervisor.
There was a meeting the morning of the 8th.
Yes, right.
In Timoney's office. And Sylvester Johnson, the chief of detectives, was there.
Yeah.
Tomeno and Musey were there from homicide. The chief of homicide was there.
Yeah, the captain, Clapton Glenn. Yes.
Tomeno and Musey know that somebody said that there was a senior officer called that night. In their depositions, they said they knew. They had already read the interviews. They said no. They knew sitting in that meeting that there was no senior officer called to the scene that night. Now, maybe nobody spoke up, but they knew. They were ordered to go back and re-interview those two officers. At the end of that meeting, those two officers were not re-interviewed for 2 years. Now, there was some indifference to the facts here. One of the things is they turned us against them almost immediately. When we were at homicide that first night. So we get to Philadelphia at 7:30 that evening. They immediately put us in a patrol car, take us over to headquarters, and we end up talking to the homicide detectives. They give us a sheet of paper as they're about to leave with Tomeno. Tomeno was the assigned detective. Musey was the sergeant. They give us a paper with their names and phone number on it and said, if you need anything, call them. You need to go over in the morning to the morgue and you need to ID the body. We will have an officer at your hotel. They got us a hotel reservation. We'll have an officer at your hotel at 9:00. We were up. We didn't sleep much that night, as you might imagine. We were up early. We went to breakfast. At 8:15, I tried to call homicide. Homicide was impossible to get through that day. I kept calling homicide. Finally, I got through around 10, and somebody told me, "Oh, well, the medical examiner's been called on some other matter, and we can't get over there until he gets there. You've got to see him." Finally, around 11 o'clock, I got frustrated and I called the morgue. And I said, what's going on? I'm told that we're supposed to come ID a body and the medical examiner's not there. And they said, the medical examiner's been here since 8:30 this morning. You don't need to see him. All you're going to do is ID the body. You can come over here right now. And I called back to Musey and I talked to Musey and said, what the hell's going on? And he said, well, I'll find out and I'll get back to you. At 12 o'clock, I finally got somebody to answer the phone and tell me that they were sending a patrol car over immediately to pick us up. He got there about 1 o'clock. Now, it was about 4 blocks from the police headquarters.
Fourth and North.
Huh?
Fourth and North.
Okay. So here we are. It's about 40 blocks from our hotel to the morgue. If they'd taken the Crosstown Expressway, we could have gotten over there in 15 minutes. Here we are on a Friday afternoon. It's raining. This guy takes us through the city streets, one by one, every stoplight at every intersection, till we got over there and ID'd the body and came back through those 40 blocks. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We were supposed to be there at 9. And then we had to get in the car and get back to home because my sister and brother were flying in one from St. Louis and one from Kansas City. And we needed to be there when they got there. Now, as we were driving out of town, John Timoney was holding a press conference to give the description that I just explained. And it became pretty apparent to us that they just held us hostage for a day, where nobody in the press could find us, where we couldn't start getting information. And, they got us off to kind of the wrong foot. And then as I started pestering detectives about the investigation, about the officer on the scene, about the cops, they were telling us, well, these cops weren't prepared. What conclusion were we supposed to draw?
Syl, on that note, we've asked you for a lot in this episode to recount, no doubt, the toughest day of your life. I'm just going to end this part with saying, as a young cop and also through most of my life, there's an expression my father taught me, and I think it was reinforced in the police department. Sometimes you have to err on the side of caution. And I think if those two officers, with or without a supervisor, would have considered maybe making administrative error and taking that door down that Parm did the next day, it sounds like with quite ease, as big as he may have been. We don't know exactly what would have happened, but probably no more rapes from what it turns out to be.
If there was
or murders.
Was a person that deserved to have somebody help them when they called for help, it was Shannon Schieber.
It was.
She never, ever failed to reach out her hand. And in the one time in her life where she really needed it, it just didn't happen.
The system failed her. And I, as Ray said earlier, my sympathy goes with you and your family. Back then, to this day, I read about it in the media, and we tried to do everything we could to finally bring that case together. I'm gonna, Syl, would you be willing to come back? I'm gonna let you catch your breath a bit here. Would you be willing to come back, Chuck, you too?
Absolutely.
And let's end this particular episode, as tough as this was, and if it's not affecting you out there like it is me, and I've lived through some of these things as a police officer, FBI agent, then you have to reconsider what's serious about life. Ray, any final words? I'm gonna take us out.
I would just give 2 fan shout-outs that have listened to the first episode, and they send their condolences to you and your wife and your son and your entire family. So they're both doctors, and I happen to be going in, and they kind of know I do this, and they said, we heard what you were doing, and it's, I'm not going to use last names, but it's Zach and Kristen from Christiana Care, and they're right with you. And I know we were talking about doctors tonight, so now you get a lot of people in your corner here. So thanks for listening, Zach and Kristen.
Yeah, and everyone else out there, thanks for listening, watching. We're going to come back in the next episode. We're going to pick up with Syl Schieber and Chuck Boyle, and they're going to walk us through more of this case. You've heard probably the worst part of it, but the bad news isn't going away, as we're going to learn here. So thanks, everyone. Please subscribe. Please like everything you hear. Thanks to our producers, Matt McLaughlin, Matt Robinson, our music coordinator, Rick Schilling, and for Ray Carr and Jim Fitzgerald, for Syl and Chuck. See you guys next episode, everybody, and please tune in to the next episode of Cold Red.